So now introducing our last speaker, Betty Melon, who is a vegan anarchist and agronomist from Te Whenua Moemoeā, the land of the Dreamtime, Australia. Betty lives on Wurundjeri Land and works within social justice movements, including the local and international animal rights movement. I've listened to some of Betty's previous talks and I'm really excited to hear her today. Tēnā koe, Betty.
Hello, everyone. Is my sound okay? Yeah? Okay. All right. So my name is Betty. Thank you so much, Catherine, for inviting me to speak at this event today. I'm very honored to be here, and thank you so much to Cressida and Summer. I really enjoyed your presentations as well. So I would like to acknowledge that I'm speaking to you today from the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. Sovereignty over these lands was never ceded. I acknowledge and stand in solidarity with their ongoing resistance to colonialism and pay my respects to their elders past, present, and emerging. And going forward, I think it's important that we are centering decolonization in all of our activism for animals and for any cause. So in the ancient year of 2019, I spoke at the Australian Animal Activist Forum on the topic of forming alliances with other movements. So rather than rehashing all the points that I made in that talk, today I want to share with you some lessons I've learned from doing this work. And I hope that some of these lessons might be useful to you in your activism and advocacy for animals, humans, and the environment. If you want to go and watch my original talk on this topic, it's called Forming Alliances with Other Movements by Betty Melon, and it's up on the YouTube channel Collectively Free Kulin Nations. So that one's a bit more heavy on theory, but today I want to get more down to the sort of practical side of things. So I first got involved with activism at the organizing level through the animal rights movement. And while I've since been involved with several other movements, animal liberation continues to be a cause I keep coming back to. Not because I believe that it's more important than any of those other movements, but really because I believe that there isn't enough people talking about the animal liberation struggle in a way that is holistically anti-oppressive and unapologetically anti-speciesist. So I'm an anarchist, and if anyone is not familiar with that, it basically means that I'm opposed to all unjust systems of domination and hierarchy. So that includes systems like capitalism, white supremacy, patriarchy, and of course the human domination over all other animals. I consider my anarchism to be inextricably intertwined with my veganism, and therefore I absolutely include animals in my anti-oppression work. However, I have found, and you might have noticed this too, that leftist spaces can be extremely closed to having conversations about animal oppression. You may have also found that some animal rights activists are very determined to remain single issue and often imply that addressing other systems of oppression, even when they present themselves within the animal rights movement, is somehow a dilution of the cause. All of this can be pretty difficult and sometimes extremely frustrating to navigate, but I believe that this is very important work because we know and history has shown us that systems of oppression are mutually reinforcing. So we can't just be selectively leaving any marginalized group out of the conversation, and that absolutely includes animals. So now I want to share with you some lessons I've taken away from doing this work over the past few years, and I really hope that some of this will be useful to you in doing this work for yourself. So my first tip is speak to power or focus on advocating to communities that you are part of. So when I talk about speaking to power, I want us to be thinking about who in our society holds the most power to exploit animals. And we do live in a white supremacist society. I'm speaking from the Australian context, but I think that this applies to every colonized nation, that most of the animals we're exploiting were animals that were brought here by European colonizers, and their exploitation has been used as a way to take over and control very large portions of Indigenous land. So I think we need to be looking at these white supremacist systems and viewing animal agriculture as being part of that. And as well as recognizing that white people living in Western countries are still the ones that primarily benefit from systems of global systems of animal and human exploitation. So when I talk about speaking to communities that you are part of, for me, I want to be looking at white leftist ones that perhaps aren't vegan. And I think that I'm in a good position to speak to that community. Whereas if you're part of other communities, I definitely encourage you to raise this within your space, because people are going to be more receptive to people within their own community knowing that they have some understanding of their own struggle. So when I'm speaking to white leftists, I often want to emphasize that animal exploitation is linked to every other issue that they care about. When we think about workers' rights, sexual exploitation, land rights, it's all linked. And often a response that we get from non-vegan leftists is saying something like, there is no ethical consumption under capitalism. And personally, I think if someone's using that as a reason to not go vegan, it's a bit of a cop-out. I do think it is our responsibility to divest from these systems, especially if we're part of the group that is benefiting most from these systems. So my next tip is emphasize the ways that animal exploitation harms marginalized human communities. So I touched on this a little bit already, but we can talk about things like environmental racism. So that is the proximity that often of farms, factory farms and slaughterhouses often being placed in lower socioeconomic communities, and the impact that that has on air quality and things like that. The rights of farm and slaughterhouse workers. So when thinking about slaughterhouse workers, I think it's good to maybe read some first-hand accounts of what it's like to work in a slaughterhouse. And I really think this work is inherently violent. It's an inherently traumatic place to work. I don't think anybody comes out of doing work like that feeling totally okay. It does really have an impact on people with things like PTSD. So I think that slaughterhouse work can't be reformed. I think it's inherently violent, and obviously I advocate for abolishing that sort of work and that sort of system. We also need to look at the way that governments tend to subsidize animal agriculture and animal products, how they're often made to be much cheaper than fresh fruit and vegetables, even though they are much more resource intensive. They should be more expensive. And I think the motivation for that, so Samar was talking about this a bit, a lot of it is to do with the privatization and control of Indigenous land, because animal agriculture is much more intensive than plant agriculture. And that is not to say that plant agriculture doesn't have problems as well with like workers' rights violations. But if we're thinking about the scale of these industries, animal agriculture is so much larger. And as I said, I don't think animal agriculture can be reformed, whereas I think that plant agriculture can be. I think there can be a way to do that that is sustainable and much more ethical. So my next tip is make veganism part of a broader conversation about food justice. So this goes into a lot of what I was talking about before. I would really recommend people check out the website of the Food Empowerment Project. So they have a whole section on that website about issues surrounding food injustice. So we need to consider that animals and humans exploited in the food system are deserving of justice, deserving of their rights. Something else that I want to mention is the system of vertical integration. So that is basically when you have one company or a very small number of companies controlling every point of the supply chain. So if we think about chickens that are raised for meat, you've got an example I can think of is Tyson Foods, which is US based. They own the genetics of the chickens, and then they own the feed that the farmers are supposed to feed the chickens. They own the distribution, they own the slaughterhouses. So they're controlling every point in the supply chain, and there is no competition there. And that usually means that everyone working in that supply chain gets they don't get a good deal out of that. They're often squeezed on prices, not getting good prices for their produce. So yeah, I think that's important to bring up when we're talking about food justice. So my next tip is know and cite Black, Indigenous, and vegans of color. So I think we need to remember that we're not starting this work. We are expanding on a lot of work that has already been done. We want to be adding to this conversation. So I think it's really important to acknowledge people that have been doing this work for a long time, as well as subverting this narrative that veganism is a white thing or veganism is for white people. So a few people I would recommend checking out, and this is by no means an exhaustive list. There's so many great people out there. Christopher Sebastian, if people have heard of him, he has a really great blog talking, he goes into a lot of nuance talking about animal rights and veganism and some of the politics and culture surrounding that. Af and Silko, I think they were already mentioned in both of the presentations. So definitely read the book Afroism. I found that very transformative, the way that I view animal liberation through, I guess, a critical race lens. Afko also wrote a follow-up book called Racism as Zoological Witchcraft. So that's a really good one to check out as well. Vegan Voices of Color is both a Facebook page, but they write blog posts as well. So that's run by Unique Vance and Aaron Luxer, who are both Black vegans based in the USA. Lauren Ornelas is an American-Mexican woman who was the founder of the Food Empowerment Project. So she has been doing this work for a really long time, and she definitely has a lot of great information that she's sharing with everyone. I also wanted to mention Angela Davis. So Angela Davis hasn't primarily done her work in animal liberation, but she is vegan and she has started to talk about that a little bit more. But I just think her work is incredible across all areas. And when we want to talk about forming alliances with other movements, I think it's great to check out people who are vegan but do work in a lot of other areas as well. My next tip is to build real relationships with people rather than tokenizing. So I think people will start to trust you in a real way when you show up for their cause. So I think we need to be, if we want to form alliances with other movements, we need to be showing up for other movements in a genuine way. And I think if you keep showing up, if you keep supporting, if you keep building community and offering mutual aid, people are going to be more receptive to what you have to say when you've built up that trust. And I think that real relationships have a solid foundation, whereas tokenizing people is sort of quite flimsy. And I think everybody's going to like get more out of building real communities and building real relationships. My next tip is understand the link between animal oppression and ableism. So often I see the justification that people give for exploiting animals is they might say things like, oh, animals are not as intelligent as us, so they don't really understand what's happening to them. And this can be used as a justification for their exploitation. But I think we really need to be calling that out for what it is, and it's straight up ableism. We would never use that as a justification for exploiting humans that maybe have intellectual disabilities. We should recognize that disabled persons, whether they're human or not, still have value. They value their own lives, and it's no excuse for their exploitation. My next tip is understand how animalization is linked to racial injustice. So this is something that was very much brought up in the book Afroism, but a lot of Black vegans have written on this topic. So this is the concept that when we compare and reduce humans to animals, that often is used as a justification for exploitation, because it's not illegal to kill animals and animals aren't considered to have land rights. So if we reduce human beings to that position, then that I think is used as a justification for atrocities like slavery and colonization and that sort of thing. So yeah, being viewed as less than human as a justification for inhumane treatment. And I even think that word inhumane is quite, or humane is quite speciesist, because it sort of centers the way that we expect treatment of humans. Whereas we know that humans have often been reduced to animals and still are in the present day context. So I recommend like reading the work of Black vegans on that, because it's important to get that real like firsthand perspective on that and listen to people that have actually experienced animalization themselves. My next tip is don't shy away from animal rights being a worthy cause in and of itself. So far I've talked a lot about the human impact of animal exploitation and how that relates to humans. And I think, like, when I'm talking to leftists, I often find that leftists don't really care about animals. And I'm sad to say that, but that really does seem to be the case a lot of the time. So I think that it is a little bit problematic to only talk about animal exploitation as it relates to humans, because animals are worthy in and of themselves of their liberation, and they don't deserve to be exploited by us. So I would say one way to do that is emphasize the way that animals resist their own exploitation. So if you've watched any footage from inside a slaughterhouse, I think we can see that animals are resisting their exploitation, resisting their oppression right up until the last moment. And there's also lots of really great stories out there about cases where animals have escaped their exploitation and gone to try and live a life outside of human exploitation. So I think it's really important to share those stories. Obviously, the marginalized group we fight for in this case are non-human animals, and they can't be at events like this presenting about their own oppression, but we still need to amplify their voices and amplify the ways that they are resisting human exploitation. My next tip is speak out against speciesism. So call it out when you see it and hear it. And I will say, like, people probably aren't going to like you doing this. They might find it a bit weird, but I think we need to normalize it because speciesism is something that is so incredibly normalized, like using animal names as an insult for humans, for example. I think that that just positions animals in this position of that being called an animal is an insult, because we view animals in this lower state in comparison to us. Okay, and my last tip is stand your ground, but pick your battles. So unfortunately, some people are just not going to be ready for this message. They're going to have a lot of resistance up to this message. Your energy is valuable, so I would say don't waste too much time on people that aren't worth it. I would say focus your energy on people that are ready to hear it, but also be prepared to play the long game. Sometimes it does take a long time to get through to people. Sometimes it might take years of having relationships with people. So, have some patience, but still stand your ground, and, don't waver on your convictions surrounding animal rights. So that's pretty much all I have to say. I just wanted to say thanks so much to the organizers for inviting me to speak. Yeah, this has been really great today. So thank you so much, everyone, for being here as well.
Tēnā koe, Betty. Thanks so much for speaking. Those were really important, useful and practical thoughts. And I was taking away the importance of relationship building and just thinking about the protest yesterday in Ōtepoti, Dunedin. It was an environmental protest where activists stopped a train carrying coal to Fonterra, a dairy company. And just thinking if only we'd had those relationships as the animal rights movement with the environmental movement, so that we could have potentially participated in these kind of actions or acted in solidarity in some way. So yeah, I think relationships are really key. So I'll just pass over to Mark now for the questions. And
okay, yes. Anyone? There's actually been lots and lots of comments while you were talking, Betty. People suggesting things and everything like that. Really interesting reading, but there's no actual questions as far as I can tell. So if anyone's got questions, throw them in there. But I'm going to start with, I have a question for Betty, and then we'll get to Simone's question as well in a minute. So Betty, you talked about slaughterhouse workers and kind of realizing that they're oppressed and everything. And I'm just wondering, how do you approach the idea of slaughterhouse, like you talked about slaughterhouse work needs to be abolished, but at the same time, you want to support people in those industries. How do you approach the contradiction there? Like, talking about reform versus revolution. Like, we'd like to see slaughterhouses abolished, but in the meantime, how do you approach things like slaughterhouse workers wanting better pay and conditions?
Well, I would say I'm not opposed to slaughterhouse workers having better pay and condition while slaughterhouses still exist, obviously. But I think like it's important to remember that the slaughterhouse workers are really oppressed by this system as well. They're not the ones benefiting from the system. That said, I do think that we need to be working on real transitions away from these systems. They obviously can't be abolished overnight, and there needs to be other pathways for people to go into. If people follow the Farm Transparency Project, which was formerly known as Aussie Farms, it's not really been launched yet, but I know that they're working on a transition program that's sort of more for farmers to transition to a plant-based system. But yeah, I guess we're sort of playing the long game here. Like there's a lot of work that needs to be done. Nothing's going to happen quickly. But yeah, I think it's important to recognize the slaughterhouse workers aren't benefiting from that work. And so I think abolishing that type of work, as long as we have alternative pathways, is going to be a good thing for all persons exploited in that system.
Right, cool, thank you. Philip has a question. Philip has told us he has a question. I think he wants to ask it with his microphone. So we'll just throw Philip in.
Kia ora, Betty. Thank you for your talk. So I guess my question is more of a comment. I guess I wonder what you think about this. When we're talking about liberation for animals and acting on behalf of animals and being allies perhaps to animals, I think a lot of the time we refer to them only or exclusively in terms of their being oppressed beings. And in doing so, we risk construing them as inherently being victims. And yeah, I wonder how you think about this in relation to some of the comments that you've made. So for example, you highlighted in your talk, for example, animals resisting their own exploitation. And I think obviously that's really, really important when we're talking about animal liberation, but I wonder if there's perhaps more scope for talking about the ways in which animals engage politically, just generally, and can engage politically. And I'm thinking of, especially of some of the work that, and I'm not sure how you pronounce her name, Eva Meyer, perhaps, Meyer, Dutch philosopher. I'm not sure if you've heard of her work. She wrote a book that was published last year, I think, called When Animals Speak, and the subtitle is Toward an Interspecies Democracy. She has a really interesting discussion at the end about how non-human animals can be understood as having political agency in the broad sense. So some examples might be, for example, companion animals exercising agency when it comes to determining where they might walk, where they might sleep. And she also talks about the implications for us in terms of how we might construct our settlements and the places in which we inhabit. And so, yeah, I guess I just want to put that out there as a thought that I had in listening to your talk, because it seems to me that when we talk about advocating for animals, we need to be very careful about not adding to their ongoing victimization by only talking about them in terms of their being victims of us, because there is obviously a lot more to them than that. Nā reira. I'll mute myself again, and yeah, interested to hear if you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, thanks for that question and comment. It is something that I think about quite a lot, actually. I think it's really important to frame the conversation as, animals being persons that have agency, they have their own wants. And when it comes to systems like animal agriculture, obviously we've bred a lot of these animals to such an extent that they can't really survive independent of humans. So like, I sometimes like to think about things in terms of what kind of future would I want to see for animals? And eventually we would phase out the breeding of animals. So we wouldn't have these animals that have been genetically selected to serve our needs. So then what would the relationship with humans and other animals look like going into the future? And I can only speculate about that, really, but I don't think that we're going to have no relationship with animals whatsoever, but I just hope that the relationships in the future won't be exploitative. So I hope that we would be living in environments where we're sort of sharing with animals, living in conjunction with them. We might form relationships with them even, but I would want those relationships to be mutual and not exploitative. I'm not really sure if that answers your question, but yeah, I agree that we shouldn't be, we need to recognize the oppression of animals, but they are not just victims. They're not passive in what's happening to them. And I really think we need to be raising that all the time as advocates for animals. Mm-hmm.
Okay, thank you. Sorry, I was just typing away in the background, getting the question sorted. So I've just put, Simone asked a question earlier and I've just reprinted it in the chat.
Mark, before we get to that, there's also a question from Joanne, which I'm not sure
Oh, okay.
you saw.
I
think there was.
Oh, yes, yeah, there was. Yep. Okay, so we'll do Joanne's one first. So Joanne writes, I agree with everything you've said, Betty, but I think building community is very difficult and that difficulty is rarely addressed. The assumption that people can do it can be ableist. What are your thoughts? So I think there's a thought on the difficulties of building community and alliances, Betty.
Yeah, I'm not sure if I like have a good answer to that question because I've definitely felt these difficulties myself. I think especially when, you know, all of us are just trying to survive under capitalism. A lot of us are working quite a lot. So sometimes people don't really have capacity to join in on things. And I sort of think this year, 2020, where we've had to be socially distancing from each other has kind of, I think the conversation about ableism and people's capacity has really sort of come to the forefront. So perhaps more, you know, especially, you know, Melbourne is such a big city and it can often be hard for people to get to all the one place to have a meeting or something like that. So I think having meetings on Zoom is a great way for people to not have to make that travel time. Yeah, I don't know if I have an answer that's really going to be like satisfying to this. But I think it's something we can't expect to happen overnight. Community building is something that happens slowly and yeah, and it is work that we have to keep doing constantly. It's not something that can just happen by coincidence, I guess.
Okay, cool. Trev has one, which is an interesting and difficult question. Trev says, what's the best way to balance or define the different tolerance levels of oppressive attitudes and behaviours within different spaces? E.g., what levels of racism or sexism or ableism are tolerated or not tolerated versus speciesist attitudes and behaviours? This can be on an individual level or on a group level. And I suspect Trev's talking about when you're talking about leftist spaces, you know, active and leftist spaces. You know, the easy answer is to say, well, we don't tolerate any of that kind of stuff. But how do you deal with that versus, say, speciesist attitudes and leftist spaces?
So one thing that I want to say on that, I also just want to say if any of the previous speakers want to answer questions as well, I just have one thought on this. So in terms of when it comes to tolerating things like racism, I'm not somebody that experiences racism as a white person. So I kind of think that it is more the job of someone like me to do that work of going through like explaining racism to white people that might be perpetuating that. I would totally understand if you're somebody that experiences that sort of oppression. I don't think that you need to put yourself through that unless you feel like you're able to. And I would maybe argue that it's kind of the same thing with speciesism. So all of us are humans, which means that we're part of the group that is dominant over other animals. So I do think that there has to be some level of patience with people. It particularly becomes a challenge when, like, if I'm showing up for an anti-racist struggle and perhaps there is speciesism being perpetuated in that space, it is like a really delicate balance of like how much is it my responsibility to call out speciesism in a space like that. And I don't know if there is like one answer. I think it's kind of a case-to-case basis. Like for me, I draw the line of if somebody is asking me to cook animal-based foods, I'm not going to be doing that because that is against my own ethics. And I might have to do some explaining to someone of why I refuse to do that. Yeah, I don't know. I'm wondering if any of the other speakers have, or anyone in this meeting has any comments on that actually, because I'm not sure if I have a clear answer to that question.
I don't have an answer either because I think it's a really complicated question with a lot of nuance. But I thought I would share an example of when something like this has come across my radar. So I assume most of you know who Esther the Wonder Pig is, and she has an Instagram page and a Facebook page, but obviously the people who curate that for her are her gay dads, who are humans obviously. But there was a little bit of controversy, I can't remember when it was, I think it must have been last year, where one of the men who look after Esther the Wonder Pig were involved. There was a video of a woman going up to a anti-abortion protest and basically like being really aggressive, which is fine because anti-abortion is horrific. But she was basically saying like, you are, making decisions about my body that is not fair, and like I should have bodily autonomy. And one of the dads of Esther the Wonder Pig said, if I advocated for animals in that way, no one would take me seriously. And I think that really struck for me, like the difference between advocating for the ways we're marginalized ourselves and the way we advocate for people that we're trying to be allies to. And so I think this really just draws upon Betty's point that like we're allies for animals. And so, it doesn't impact us if we advocate for them badly, it doesn't impact us, it impacts them. And so we should always, if we're trying to be the very best allies for animals that we can be, we should be doing that in the best way. And that probably doesn't, that doesn't involve like alienating people. But if you're a person who experiences marginalization because of racism or because of misogyny or whatever, you don't have to tolerate that, and whatever emotions you feel because of that, you can express in any way, and that's, well, most ways, and that's absolutely fine in my opinion. So I just wanted to like support Betty's point with a clear example where I advocate for animals and I advocate for people of color in the best ways that I can, and I try and be like calm and think about what I'm saying and try and make good points. But if someone is like oppressing me as a non-binary person, as a queer person, as a fat person, like I feel like I don't have to tolerate that. Yeah, so.
Kind of, I was going to make a somewhat of a similar point. There is like different social acceptability levels when it comes to calling things like that out. There's more social awareness about racism, sexism, etc. And because animal oppression is so pervasive, it's kind of like, for me, I had to answer this question myself, like, do I even go to spaces where animals are being consumed? And the exploitation of animals is so rampant. And the conclusion I personally reached was yes, to put myself in those spaces because my mere existence was kind of filling out that exploitation. And we need to be really like vocal and put ourselves in those uncomfortable situations as much as possible for us within our capabilities so that we can call attention to that practice. Yeah, just a small note, not really an answer.
And thank you for that. And you just made me think, Summer, talking about, I've often, on that last point about putting yourself in spaces, I've often seen seen some activists talk about vegans as being oppressed, or people saying, "Oh, people are discriminating against vegans," and I personally don't think that's possible. I think we're in this for the animals. It's not about us. Even when people discriminate against vegans, I don't feel that is a problem. Yeah, so just the difference between thinking of ourselves as the victims and thinking of the animals. Sorry, that wasn't very coherent, which is why I'm doing the Q&A and not speaking.
I was just going to say one thing on that, if I can.
Yep. Mm-hmm.
I think when it comes to vegans, like, we're neither an oppressed group nor are we a privileged group. It's like we're a group of allies to an oppressed group. But of course, like, a lot of vegans experience marginalization in many different ways, and that might inform some of our activism to animals. But yeah, I don't think it's right to say that vegans are oppressed. It's the animals that are oppressed.
Yeah, cool. Okay. So the last question was actually from earlier on from Simone, and I reposted it there. And she asks, how does consumer demand-driven change, i.e. the emergence of products catering to the vegan market, like vegan cheese and lab-grown meat, sit alongside or interact with decolonial approaches which challenge crown sovereignty and capitalism? And I thought that was a really interesting question, because for me, that's the big thing. Like, all of the speakers today have been talking about or critiquing how we do activism, like Cressida talked about the kind of focus on consumer activism. So how do we, which seems to be the dominant form of animal activism, at least if you look at the internet. So I suppose this is for all three of you. How does that sit with, how do we figure it out? Consumer activism versus the more radical, challenging colonization and capitalism. How do we
My thoughts on this is that I think it's natural for that revolutionary energy that we bring, no matter what space that is, to be like some subsumed back into the capitalist system and then represented to us as a sort of consumer's choice, as something that the market can, something that can be understood through the lens of the market and through economic relationships. And so, like, if we look at feminism, for example, it's represented to us as this idea of like breaking the glass ceiling, even though a lot of non-male people don't even get to enter into the building in the first place, let alone have access to the ceiling. It's about bringing women into the workforce, and tackling racism becomes about diversity in the workforce, as opposed to destroying racist structures in a radical way. So I think veganism has sort of gone down that road as well. It is inherently a revolutionary idea to not exploit animals, but then it's sold back to us as a consumer's choice, as a form of diet. And I think that actually gets in our way of getting the message across that that animals are not subhuman, that they're not inferior based on some sort of perceived biological inability.
So something I want to say on that is that an increase in the plant-based market doesn't necessarily equate to a decrease in the animal-based market. So capitalism is an economic system that relies on infinite growth, and the growth of the plant-based market. So to give an example, when the Impossible Whopper was introduced to Burger King in the USA, the CEO of Burger King actually had this quote that said, we don't see people swapping out the original Whopper for the Impossible Whopper. It's actually attracting new guests. So Burger King was just bringing in more profits from having introduced this plant-based option, but it was a win for Burger King rather than a win for the animals. So I think that's something we should keep in mind when we're talking about like plant-based products, plant-based capitalism. And I think the solution to that, although I know this is sort of like a really sort of long-term thing, is we do need to be working on building alternative food systems, so we're not so reliant on this capitalist food system. But obviously that is a really long-term project, and it's going to require a lot of work from a lot of people and a lot of solidarity among people to pull something like that off.
The only thing I have a couple of points to make. So kind of something that I wanted to say in my kōrero, but I forgot, was that just because something is plant-based doesn't mean it's free from violence. So I think that even though the things we eat as vegans aren't derived from animals, and they might be, you know, free from violence towards animals, but, you know, like the way capitalism works is that someone's getting fucked, basically, like along the system. Nothing we eat, nothing we consume is completely free from violence. And so I think that Betty's right, that like long term, hopefully we would be producing things in a much more ethical way. But as for now, like, I think that we can actually do both. I think that we can try our best. I don't think there's any excuse to not be trying within the system. I mean, of course, there are excuses if you're really low income or working class, fine. But I think that for, you know, middle class white people particularly, there's not a lot of excuses to not be attempting to make ethical decisions within the system that currently exists. But my focus on my activism is I'm always going to think about who's actually got the most power. And it is conglomerates, it is, you know, billionaires. Like, it's not individual people on the street who we're getting to go vegan one by one. So I just think that the focus on the individual is a little bit problematic. That doesn't mean I want it to go away completely, but I think we can do both. We can try and change the systems at the top, and we can encourage consumers to think more ethically about what they are consuming.